The crisp, cool air of an autumn morning greeted Dean Foster as he pulled into the hospital's parking lot, his truck's tires crunching over a layer of fallen leaves. It hadn't been long, just 6 hours ago, he was here when Carly's water broke. He'd then hurried back home to fetch her hospital bag and some last-minute essentials they'd forgotten in the rush. Now, with a bouquet of pink and white carnations resting on the passenger seat, a blend of excitement and nervous anticipation buzzed through him. Today, they'd finally meet their son. Dean caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror, raking a hand through his unruly dark hair in an attempt to tame it. His deep brown eyes looked back at him, filled with eagerness despite the tired lines etched from a sleepless night. At 32, his body still carried the strong build from his years working construction, though he'd been promoted to site supervisor 3 years earlier. The timing couldn't have been better, higher pay, better hours, just what they needed as they prepared to start a family. A smile tugged at his lips as he grabbed the flowers and Carly's bag. They'd spent 2 years trying for a baby before it finally happened. He still remembered that morning vividly. Carly had burst into the bedroom, clutching a positive pregnancy test, tears of pure joy streaming down her cheeks. That moment felt like the start of everything they'd hoped and dreamed for. The hospital's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, welcoming him inside with the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic. Dean gave a nod to the receptionist. He'd seen her plenty of times during Carly's checkups, and made his way to the elevator. His work boots squeaked against the gleaming floor, drawing a few curious glances from the hospital staff starting their shifts. 4th floor, he murmured under his breath as he hit the button. Room 412. The maternity ward was quieter than he had expected, but then again, it was only 7 a.m., far from peak visiting hours. A nurse glanced up from her desk as he approached, her tired face brightening into a friendly smile. "Mr. Foster, your wife's been asking for you. How are they?" Dean adjusted the bag on his shoulder. "How's Carly? How's the baby?" "They're both doing great. The delivery went smoothly, and you have a healthy baby boy," she replied, motioning for him to follow her down the hallway. "Would you like me to take you to their room?" "Yes, please." The nurse, her badge read Tina, guided him past several closed doors. "Your wife's still recovering, but she's awake. The baby's already been fed and is sleeping," she added, stopping outside room 412. "Just keep your voices down, and if you need any help, just press the call button." Dean thanked her, took a steadying breath, and pushed the door open. The room was dim, with soft morning light peeking through the partially closed blinds. Carly lay in the hospital bed, her blonde hair fanned out across the pillow like a halo. Even though she looked exhausted, her blue eyes brightened as soon as she saw him. "You're back," she whispered, stretching out a hand toward him. Dean stepped closer, setting the bouquet on the bedside table before taking her hand in his. "Of course I am. I brought your things too." He leaned down and gently kissed her forehead. "How are you holding up?" "Tired, and sore," she admitted, giving his hand a squeeze, "but I'm so happy. I've never been this happy." A tiny whimper came from the clear bassinet beside the bed, drawing both their eyes. Dean's heart gave a little flutter as he looked at the small bundle wrapped in blue blankets. "Can I hold him?" he asked softly. Carly nodded. "Of course. He's your son." With hands that felt far too big for the task, Dean carefully reached into the bassinet. He'd practiced for this moment, watched countless videos on how to support a newborn's head and neck, but none of that had prepared him for the reality of holding his own child for the first time. The baby wriggled a bit as Dean cradled him, then settled peacefully. "Hey there, little guy," Dean murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your dad." But as he gazed down at his son's face for the first time, the words caught in his throat. Something felt off. The baby's skin was noticeably darker than either his or Carly's pale complexion. The features, the shape of the nose, the curve of the lips, seemed to hint at a heritage neither of them shared. Dean's brain struggled to process the sight before him, even as a sinking feeling gripped his stomach and his hands began to tremble. Dean. Carly's voice sounded distant, almost like it was coming from another room. Is everything okay? He glanced from the baby back to his wife, then back again. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air suddenly too thin to breathe. Moving slowly, almost mechanically, he placed the baby back into the bassinet, though his mind was racing in 1,000 directions. Dean. Carly's tone shifted, laced with a rising sense of panic. What's wrong? He turned toward her, really looking at the woman he'd spent the last 5 years of his life with. She seemed small in the hospital bed, pale against the stark white sheets, but there was something in her expression, a fleeting glimpse of fear that had nothing to do with concern over his reaction. You knew, he said quietly. What do you mean? She asked, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. He's our son. Don't, Dean's voice was sharp now. Look at him, Carly. Really look. That child isn't mine. Of course he is, she insisted, but her voice cracked, and tears started to well up in her eyes. How can you stand there and say that? Because I'm not blind. The words burst from him, loud enough to make the baby jolt and start crying. He took a moment to lower his voice, fighting to stay calm. That baby is mixed race, Carly. You and I are both white. Explain that. Carly's face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. Dean, please. Tell me the truth, he demanded, though each word felt like it was tearing him apart. Just once, give me the truth. A sob broke from her as she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. Sorry for what? He shot back, his voice filled with raw pain. Sorry for cheating on me. Sorry for lying all this time. Sorry for letting me believe for the last 9 months that I was going to be a father. I was confused, she sobbed, her whole body shaking. It was only once, with a guy from work. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. The room seemed to tilt, and Dean reached for the back of a chair to steady himself. A guy from work. He repeated the words, tasting them like something bitter. When did this happen? 9 months ago, Carly said, wiping at her tears with a shaky hand. After we wrapped up the Morgan project. There was a party at O'Malley's, the night you said you were working late. The memory struck him like a punch to the gut. He'd offered to come pick her up that night, but she'd assured him she'd get a ride home with her colleagues. He'd even made dinner for her, waiting up until she'd stumbled in, laughing about taking too many victory shots. She gave a small, miserable nod. It was Evan. He's in accounting. We'd been flirting, and I just drank too much. Stop. Dean held up his hand, swallowing back the bile rising in his throat. I don't want to hear any more about how you betrayed our entire marriage. It was a one-time thing. Carly reached out for him, but he stepped back out of her reach. I never saw him again after that night. It didn't mean anything. One time. Dean's laugh was cold and sharp, echoing in the quiet room. You've been lying to me for 9 whole months, Carly. Every single day, you made the choice not to tell me. Every time I talked about our baby, felt him kick, made plans for our future, you chose to keep deceiving me. Those weren't mistakes. They were deliberate choices. I was scared, she whispered, fresh tears rolling down her face. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. I knew there was a chance it wasn't yours, but I hoped. I prayed it would be. And when you laid eyes on him? Dean motioned toward the bassinet. When you saw for yourself that he wasn't mine, what did you plan to do then? Carly couldn't answer, her silence spoke volumes. You were just going to let me believe he was mine. Let me raise another man's child. The realization hit Dean like a sucker punch. You were going to let me fall in love with him, bond with him, without ever knowing the truth. We still can, Carly pleaded, her voice tinged with desperation. We could raise him together. He doesn't ever need to know. No, the word burst out of him like a shot. I'm not putting my name on that birth certificate. I won't claim a child who isn't mine. You can't do this. Carly's voice trembled as she struggled to sit up straighter, panic starting to set in. He needs a father. I need you. You should have thought about that before you spread your legs for someone else. The harsh words tasted bitter, foreign, but he wanted to hurt her, to make her feel just a sliver of the agony tearing him apart. Carly recoiled as if he'd physically struck her. Please, she begged, reaching out for him once more. We can work this out. We can go to therapy, fix this. Fix this. Dean repeated, staring at her like she'd lost her mind. This isn't some cracked piece of pottery, Carly. This is our marriage. This is trust, this is love. You can't fix what you've completely shattered. Her sobs intensified, shaking her whole body as she gasped for breath. I love you, she managed to choke out. Please, don't leave me. Dean, I'll do whatever it takes. He watched her cry, memories flooding back of the countless times he'd held her, soothed her when she was upset, wiped away her tears, promising he'd always be there for her. Now, all he felt was a hollow emptiness where his heart used to be. I'm filing for divorce, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carly's head jerked up, her mascara streaking down her tear-stained cheeks. No, don't say that. Please, just hear me out. There's nothing left to discuss. He turned toward the door, each step feeling like it was weighted down by sandbags. My lawyer will be in touch. Wait, she cried out, trying to get out of the bed, only to get tangled in the sheets and 4 tubes. Don't do this. Don't throw away 5 years of our marriage. I made a terrible mistake, but I love you. Doesn't that mean anything? He paused at the doorway, meeting her eyes one last time. Love without trust isn't love at all. It's just another lie. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible. If you leave, I'll never forgive myself. Good, he said coldly, his tone final. Because I'll never forgive you either. He walked out, blocking out the sound of her renewed sobs and pleas for him to come back. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly in front of him as he made his way toward the exit, passing nurses, new parents, and visitors who were blissfully unaware of the wreckage his life had become. He reached his truck on autopilot, sliding into the driver's seat, staring out at nothing. The future he'd meticulously planned lay in ruins, scattered around him like debris. The woman he thought he knew had betrayed him in the most gut-wrenching way. The child he'd longed to hold wasn't his own. His eyes drifted to the "baby on board" sign Carly had insisted on sticking to the back window months ago. Rage surged up inside him, and he tore it off, crumpling it in his fist before tossing it into a nearby trash can. He climbed back into the truck and turned on the engine, but the familiar rumble did nothing to calm the turmoil raging in his chest. As he pulled out of the hospital parking lot, his phone started buzzing. Carly's picture flashed on the screen. It was a snapshot from their anniversary dinner just a few months ago. She looked radiant, smiling, her hand resting gently on her pregnant belly. He'd thought she'd never looked more beautiful. Now, the image made his stomach churn. Dean switched off his phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. He didn't have a destination in mind as he drove away, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between himself and the hospital, between himself and the lies, between himself and the shattered remains of what was once his marriage. The sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows over the road. Somewhere back at that hospital, Carly was probably still crying, maybe still hoping he'd change his mind and come back to forgive her. And somewhere in that same hospital, a baby who wasn't his was sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware of the storm his birth had unleashed. Dean tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning bone white. He'd always believed in building things to last, whether it was houses, relationships, or families, but Carly had taken the trust they'd built and shattered it beyond repair. There was no fixing this kind of betrayal. The road stretched out in front of him, empty and uncertain, but one thing was for sure, he wasn't bringing any baby home. Not now, not ever. The metallic jingle of keys echoed through the quiet hallway as Dean unlocked the door to his new apartment, Unit 307, 3rd floor, facing west. It was about as far from his old life as he could get without leaving the city entirely. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing a bare, empty space he now called home, a single bedroom, minimal furniture, and plain walls that seemed to amplify the silence. No family photos, no decorations, nothing that could remind him of the life he'd left behind. 2 weeks had dragged by since that day at the hospital, 2 weeks of crashing at cheap motels, avoiding calls, and trying to piece together whatever was left of his life. The apartment was a temporary solution, but it beat waking up every day surrounded by memories of his ruined marriage. His phone buzzed yet again, for the 20th time that day. Carly's number flashed on the screen, along with a picture he hadn't brought himself to delete yet, her beaming smile from their anniversary dinner just 3 months ago. She'd looked so happy that night, resting her hand protectively on her pregnant belly. He'd thought it was their baby she was cradling. Now, the memory turned his stomach. Without a second thought, he declined the call, just as he had every other time. Let her leave another voicemail he'd never listened to, or send another text he wouldn't bother to read. The wound was still too raw, the betrayal too fresh to even consider engaging. A sharp knock at his door pulled him out of his thoughts, 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slower ones. It was Carly's signature knock. His whole body tensed, his fight-or-flight response kicking in. "Dean," a different voice called from the other side. "It's Ryan. Open up, man." The tension in Dean's shoulders eased, replaced by a different kind of dread. Ryan Baker had been his best friend since college, and now, as one of the top divorce attorneys in the city, he was Dean's legal lifeline. If Ryan was here unannounced, it couldn't be good news. Dean opened the door to find Ryan standing there, looking every bit the part in his sharp charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and a red power tie. His briefcase seemed to be stuffed to the brim, and the worry etched on his face did nothing to settle Dean's nerves. "You look like crap," Ryan greeted him, eyeing Dean's wrinkled t-shirt and the 3-day-old stubble on his face. "Thanks for the pep talk." Dean stepped aside to let him in. "Beer?" "It's 2 p.m. That wasn't a no." Ryan sighed, dropping his briefcase onto the kitchen counter with a heavy thud. "We need clear heads for this conversation. Carly's lawyer reached out to my office this morning." Dean's jaw clenched involuntarily at the mention of her name. "And? She's filing for child support." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Dean gripped the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles turned white. "Come again." Dean's voice was barely a whisper. "She's arguing that because you were her husband at the time of conception and birth, you're legally obligated to support the child," Ryan explained, pulling a thick stack of documents from his briefcase. "It's a bold move, but it's not entirely out of left field." "Don't tell me this isn't unexpected." Dean's laugh was bitter, bordering on hysteria. "She cheats on me, gets pregnant by another man, lies about it for 9 months, and now she expects me to pay for it. That's not unexpected, that's insanity." "The law can get tricky in situations like this," Ryan began carefully. "There's nothing tricky about it," Dean shot back, his voice bouncing off the empty walls. "That child isn't mine. End of story." "I get it," Ryan replied, his tone calm and measured, as if he'd said these words 100 times before. "And we're going to challenge it. But you need to brace yourself, this could get ugly. Uglier than discovering my wife's been deceiving me for 9 months. Uglier than cradling a baby I thought was mine, only to see another man's features staring back at me. Yes." Ryan spread the legal documents across the counter like a commander setting up a battle plan. "We'll need to request an official DNA test," contest the assumption of paternity, and be prepared for a potentially long and drawn-out court fight. Dean raked both hands through his hair, pacing the cramped kitchen. Unbelievable. There's more. Ryan hesitated, shuffling through the stack of papers. Carly's asked for a meeting. She says she wants to talk things over before we dive deeper into legal proceedings. No, the response was instant, raw. I've got nothing left to say to her. It might be worth considering. I said no. Dean's tone was final, cutting off any further discussion. She lost the right to have a conversation when she decided to lie to me for months on end. A sharp knock on the door interrupted them. There was no mistaking the pattern, 3 quick taps, then 2 slower ones. How the hell did she find me? Dean growled, glaring at the door. She probably followed me, Ryan admitted, looking apologetic. She was outside my office when I left. Dean, Carly's voice came through the door, quiet but insistent. Please, I know you're in there. We need to talk. No, we don't, he called back, his hands curling into fists. From now on, everything goes through our lawyers. This is absurd, her voice cracked, thick with emotion. We're still married. You can't just shut me out like this. Still married? The words sparked something dangerous in Dean, and he swung the door open with such force that Carly stumbled back, startled. You want to talk about marriage now? After what you did? She looked different than she had at the hospital, smaller, almost fragile. Wearing jeans and an oversized sweater that might have once been his, her blonde hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and dark circles under her red, swollen eyes hinted at sleepless nights mirroring his own. I know I hurt you, she said softly, wringing her hands together. But can we please talk about the baby? About us? There is no us anymore, Dean's voice was frigid. And that baby, the one you're trying to make me pay for? He's not mine. You know it, I know it, and soon enough, the court will know it too. He needs a father, she whispered. Then go find his real one, Dean snapped, his words like a slap. Go tell Evan from accounting that he's got a son. See if he's interested in playing house with you. Tears welled up in her eyes again. Evan wants nothing to do with us. He won't even return my calls. Karma's a real bitch, isn't it? How can you be so heartless? A tear slipped down her cheek. This isn't the man I married. The man you married? Dean took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low whisper. That man trusted you. That man loved you. That man died the moment I saw that baby and realized everything between us was a lie. It wasn't all a lie, Carly insisted, reaching for his arm, but he jerked away as though her touch would scald him. 5 years of marriage, everything we built together, that was real. Real? Dean's laugh was sharp, bitter. Tell me, Carly. During all those months you were pregnant, watching me paint the nursery, build the crib, plan for our future, what was going through your head? Did you secretly laugh at how clueless I was, how easily I fell for your lies? No, she sobbed, pressing her hands to her face as her shoulders heaved with emotion. I was terrified every single day. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. So instead, you let me live a lie, Dean's voice was barely above a whisper, cold and cutting. You let me believe I was going to be a dad. You let me dream about teaching my son to throw a baseball, taking him camping, all the things my father did with me. You watched me plan a future that never had a chance of being real. We can still have that future, Carly whispered, reaching out for him once more. We can start fresh, try again, have children of our own. Get out. Dean, I'm begging you. I said get out, he roared, his voice echoing down the hallway and causing a neighbor's door to creak open. Go back to the baby you had with your lover and leave me the hell alone. Ryan, ever the peacemaker, stepped between them. Carly, it's best if you go now. Any further communication should be handled through the proper legal channels. She shrugged off his attempt to console her, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. This isn't over, Dean. You can't just walk away from everything we shared. Watch me. Dean slammed the door shut in her face, his hands trembling as he slid the deadbolt into place. He could still hear her muffled sobs from the other side, but he forced himself to ignore them, just as he'd been ignoring every call and text she'd sent. Well, Ryan said after a beat of silence. That could have gone a lot smoother. You think? Dean snapped, shooting him a glare. Listen, I know you're angry. You've got every right to be. But we need to handle this carefully, Ryan said, gathering up the scattered legal papers. The court doesn't care about your feelings. They care about facts, laws, and precedents. Then give them facts, Dean growled, yanking a beer out of the fridge, no longer concerned that it was only mid-afternoon. Get the DNA test done, prove that baby isn't mine, and make sure she understands I'm not paying a single cent for her lies. It's not that straightforward. Make it straightforward, Dean's voice was steely. That's what I'm paying you for. The following weeks blurred together in a whirlwind of legal paperwork, court filings, and endless meetings. Each day brought a new hurdle, new motions to counter, fresh arguments from Carly's side. Her legal team was relentless, throwing every possible tactic into the mix, hoping something would stick. The first court hearing was the hardest, stepping into that sterile courtroom, seeing Carly seated at the plaintiff's table in a somber blue dress, trying to play the role of the perfect, wronged wife. She'd lost weight since the hospital, her face looked thinner, paler, but her eyes still searched for his, brimming with a desperate hope. All rise, the bailiff's voice rang out as Judge Laura Blackwell entered the courtroom. With her stern expression and salt and pepper hair, she looked every bit the seasoned veteran of family court, someone who had seen more marriages crumble than she could count. Be seated, she instructed, glancing through the stack of documents in front of her. Foster versus Foster. Petition for child support and contested paternity. Are all parties present? Yes, Your Honor, both attorneys replied in unison. Very well, Judge Blackwell said, peering over her reading glasses. Mr. Reynolds, you may proceed with your client's case. Carly's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie as he addressed the court. Your Honor, my client is seeking child support from her husband, who has abandoned both her and their newborn child. Under state law, a child born within a marriage is presumed to be the legal child of that marriage. Mr. Foster was involved throughout the pregnancy, helped prepare for the baby's arrival, and only decided to deny his responsibility after the child was born. Objection, Ryan said, already on his feet. Counsel's statements are misleading. My client's actions were a direct result of deception by Mrs. Foster, who intentionally concealed the true paternity of the child. Objection noted, Judge Blackwell replied, turning back to Carly's lawyer. Continue, Mr. Reynolds. The initial hearing dragged on for hours, with both sides laying out their arguments. Dean sat there, his expression a mask of stone, refusing to react to Carly's quiet sobs or the impassioned pleas from her attorney about family obligations. Despite Carly's objections, the court ordered a DNA test. Her lawyer argued it was unnecessary, citing the presumed legal relationship between Dean and the child due to the marriage, but Judge Blackwell ruled in favor of the test anyway. 2 weeks later, the DNA results arrived, just as expected, a 0% chance of paternity. But instead of accepting the truth, Carly's legal team decided to dig in even deeper. They questioned the validity of the results, claimed the lab wasn't properly certified, and even suggested the sample might have been contaminated. Every attempt to delay only strengthened Dean's resolve. She's grasping at straws, Ryan remarked after yet another exhausting day in court. Evan still refuses to acknowledge paternity, and she's quickly running out of options. That's her problem, not mine. Dean loosened his tie, feeling suffocated by the courtroom attire he now had to wear regularly. She made her choices, and now she's dealing with the fallout. The next court session hit a new low. Carly arrived with the baby, a calculated move that spectacularly backfired when Ryan pointed out how the child's appearance only reinforced their case. "Your Honor," Carly's attorney argued again. Regardless of biological paternity, Mr. Foster developed a parent-child relationship throughout the pregnancy. He participated in preparing for the baby's arrival, bought furniture, and made plans for the child's future. "I made those preparations for my child," Dean interrupted, his voice as cold as ice. "Not someone else's. Your client lied to me about who the father was. Everything I did was based on her deception. But surely you developed an emotional bond." "Objection." Ryan's voice cracked like a whip. "Relevance?" "Sustained," Judge Blackwell replied, looking weary of the emotional appeals. "Counsel, focus on the legal issues at hand." Despite the setback, Carly's team continued filing motion after motion. They tried arguing for common law parentage, claimed emotional attachment, and even cited cases where stepparents were forced to pay child support. Each argument was more desperate than the last. Through it all, Dean remained unmoved, unaffected by Carly's tears during depositions, her breakdowns in court, or her pleading looks whenever their eyes met. The final hearing took place on a crisp autumn morning. Dry leaves skittered across the courthouse steps as Dean walked inside, Ryan by his side. They'd been locked in this battle for months, but today would finally bring an end, one way or another. Carly was already seated when they entered, dressed in a simple black dress that made her look even more pale and frail than before. The baby wasn't with her this time, a small mercy, Dean thought. All rise for the Honorable Judge Blackwell. The routine played out one last time as the judge took her seat, reviewing the stack of documents before looking up at both parties with a stern expression. "I've reviewed all the evidence and arguments presented in this case," she began. "Mrs. Foster's counsel has proposed several theories of legal responsibility, while Mr. Foster's team has consistently argued paternity fraud. Before I issue my ruling, Mrs. Foster, would you like to make a final statement?" Carly rose slowly, visibly trembling. "Your Honor, I know I made mistakes, serious, terrible mistakes. But Dean and I were building a life together, creating a family. One moment of weakness shouldn't erase everything we shared." "Your Honor," Dean's voice cut through the room before the judge could respond. "May I say something?" At the judge's nod, he stood, looking directly at the bench, though he could feel Carly's desperate gaze burning into him. "That moment of weakness she mentions was followed by 9 months of intentional deceit," he began. "Every single day she chose to lie, every time I spoke about being a father, every time I made plans for our future, she knew the truth and kept silent. That isn't a mistake, it's a calculated betrayal." "Dean," Carly tried to interject. "No," Dean turned fully to face her, his voice filled with a controlled fury. "You want to talk about family? Family is built on trust, and you destroyed that trust the moment you slept with another man. Then you buried it under months of lies. And now you want me to pay for your choices, to support a child that exists because you broke our marriage vows? That's not justice, that's just another betrayal." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Judge Blackwell regarded both of them for what felt like an eternity before finally speaking. "Based on the presented evidence, including the DNA test results and the testimony about Mrs. Foster's acknowledged infidelity, I find no legal grounds to compel Mr. Foster to provide financial support for this child. The petition is denied. Additionally, I am granting Mr. Foster's counterpetition for divorce on the grounds of adultery. The marriage is hereby dissolved." Carly's sob echoed through the courtroom, but Dean felt nothing, no sense of victory, no relief. Just a hollow, empty finality. It was truly over. Ryan quietly gathered his documents, while Carly's broken voice called out to Dean one last time. "Dean, please don't let it end like this. We can still." "Goodbye, Carly," he said, cutting her off. Without another glance back, he walked out of the courtroom, Ryan trailing silently behind him. The autumn air was crisp, the wind sending leaves skittering across the steps of the courthouse. Somewhere in the city, a baby who wasn't his was likely napping peacefully, blissfully unaware of the chaos his birth had set in motion. "You doing all right?" Ryan asked as they reached their cars. "No," Dean admitted, surprising even himself with his honesty. "But I will be. You want to grab a drink, maybe talk things through?" Dean shook his head, fishing his keys out of his pocket. "Not tonight. I just need to." "Dean." Carly's voice rang out across the parking lot. She was running toward them, her heels clacking against the asphalt, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Please, don't do this," she begged, stopping just a few feet away. "Don't throw everything away. We can start over, try counseling." "There's nothing left to try," Dean's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The judge made her decision. "It's done." "The hell it is." Carly's voice rose, attracting stares from people passing by. 5 years of marriage doesn't just disappear because a judge says so. What about our dreams? The plans we made? The house we wanted to buy? The family we dreamed of building? Those dreams died the moment you chose to be with Evan, Dean said calmly, his composure only seeming to make her angrier. "As for a family, you got one now, just not with me. He won't help." The words erupted from her, as though she'd been holding them back for weeks. "I tried calling Evan again yesterday. He told me to stop bothering him, even threatened to get a restraining order if I didn't leave him alone. He refuses to even acknowledge his own child. And why exactly is that my problem?" Dean's voice was icy, unyielding. "Because you're better than him." Carly stepped closer, desperation pouring off her in waves. "You're kind, you're caring, and you would have been an incredible father." "Stop." Dean held up his hand, silencing her. "Just stop. I'm not your fallback plan, Carly. I'm not going to step in and play dad because the guy you chose over me turned out to be a spineless coward. That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is," he cut her off sharply. "You thought you could have your fling, hide the truth, and keep your comfortable life with the dependable husband. Well, guess what? The dependable husband is done. I'm done with your lies, done with your manipulation, done with you." Fresh tears streamed down her face. "Please don't say that. I love you." "No, you don't," Dean replied softly, but there was no forgiveness in his voice, only finality. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have betrayed me. If you loved me, you would have told me the truth. What you loved was the security I provided, the life we built together. But that life was built on lies, and now it's over. I'll do anything," she whispered. "Anything to make this right. There's nothing left to fix." Dean opened his car door, the metal cool under his hand. "Go home, Carly. Take care of your son. Build a new life, but leave me out of it. You can't just—" "Yes, I can," he interrupted, meeting her eyes one last time. "Goodbye, Carly." He climbed into his truck and started the engine, watching through the rearview mirror as Ryan gently guided Carly back toward the courthouse. Her shoulders shook with sobs, but Dean felt nothing. The woman he had once loved, the future they had planned, the trust they had shared, it was all gone, shattered beyond any chance of repair. The drive home passed in a haze. Traffic lights changed from red to green, cars weaved around him, but Dean hardly noticed any of it. His mind kept replaying scenes from his marriage, the laughter, the moments of joy, the love he once believed was real. Had any of it been genuine, or had she always been capable of such deep deception? His phone buzzed with a text from Ryan, "She's with her sister." "You sure you don't want that drink?" Dean quickly typed back, "No thanks," and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. He needed space, needed solitude to process the finality of what had transpired in that courtroom. When he got back to the apartment, the darkness was almost oppressive, the silence thick and suffocating. He loosened his tie, poured himself a double whiskey, and stood by the window, watching the sun sink behind the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Carly was probably still crying, still clinging to the hope that he might change his mind. Somewhere, a baby who shared none of his blood was being rocked to sleep by a woman who had tried to ensnare him with lies. But it was over now. The legal fight was finished, the marriage was officially dissolved. He was finally free, free from her manipulations, free from her tears, free from the false responsibilities she tried to lay at his feet. Yet the price of that freedom was everything he had once believed in. 3 months slipped by after the divorce, and winter had settled in, replacing the crisp air of autumn with a biting chill. Dean sat in his corner office at Foster Construction, reviewing blueprints for their latest high-end residential project. Under his guidance, the company had expanded, moving into luxury developments. Success was his best revenge, a testament that he could thrive without Carly's shadow looming over his life. The intercom buzzed, pulling him out of his concentration. "Mr. Foster," Tina's voice held a trace of hesitation, "there's a call on line 1 from First City Bank." "Put it through," he said, assuming it was about the financing for their new development. "Is this Dean Foster?" The voice on the other end was sharp, businesslike. "Yes, speaking. This is Angela Kim from First City Bank's loan department. I'm calling about an application submitted by Carly Walker, formerly known as Carly Foster. She listed you as a reference for a personal loan." Dean's grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching. "I'm not a reference for anything involving Carly Walker. Sir, she stated you were her ex-husband and could verify her employment history." "Let me make this very clear," he cut in, his tone hard and unyielding. "I want nothing to do with Carly Walker or her financial affairs. Don't contact me about her again." He hung up more forcefully than he intended, his good mood evaporating in an instant. The blueprints in front of him blurred as memories he'd tried to suppress resurfaced, memories he'd spent months trying to forget. His phone buzzed again, this time from a different number but with the same area code. "Mr. Foster," a male voice said. "This is James Morton from Morton Real Estate. I'm calling regarding Carly Walker's rental application." "No," Dean's voice was ice cold. "Whatever she told you, whatever she's applying for, I'm not involved. Do not call me again." 3 calls in one morning after months of complete silence. Why was she suddenly using his name again? The answer came in a text from Ryan, "Heads up. Evan filed a restraining order against Carly last week. She's been showing up at his office demanding money for the baby. His wife found out. This situation's about to blow up." Dean read the message, a bitter laugh escaping him. It seemed that karma had finally decided to catch up with both Carly and her lover. The intercom buzzed once more. Tina sounded anxious. "Mr. Foster, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." "Who is it?" Dean asked, already feeling the tension creep back into his body. "He says his name is Evan Stone from Morgan Accounting." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Dean's hands clenched into fists, knuckles turning white against the edge of his desk. He considered sending security to throw Evan out, but no, better to confront this head-on. "Send him in," Dean said, his voice steely. The door opened a moment later, and Evan Stone walked in. He was tall, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The light blue silk tie stood out against his dark skin. This was the man who had played a part in destroying Dean's marriage, the father of Carly's child, the man who had abandoned them both. "Foster," Evan's voice faltered, the usual polished confidence nowhere to be found. "Thanks for agreeing to see me." "Make it quick," Dean replied, staying seated, forcing Evan to remain standing. "Why are you here?" "It's about Carly." "Then we're done." Dean turned back to his blueprints, dismissing him with a wave. "Please. Evan took a step forward, desperation evident in his tone. She's out of control. She's been showing up at my office, my house. She's calling my workplace, telling everyone I abandoned my son. Your son. Dean's voice could have frozen the air. The one you want nothing to do with? I never wanted any of this, Evan muttered, running a hand over his face, his calm exterior beginning to crack. It was just one night. We were drunk, celebrating the Morgan project. She never mentioned she was married. Dean finally rose to his full height, towering over Evan at 6 feet 2 inches. You worked in the same office. You saw the wedding ring on her finger. You knew exactly what you were doing. Look, I'm not proud of what happened, Evan said, his voice strained. But I can't deal with the baby. My wife. Your wife. Dean's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flashing across them. You're married too. Evan swallowed, retreating a step. Yes. 10 years, 2 kids. If this comes out, I'll lose everything, my marriage, my job. Good. Dean's response was sharp, like a gunshot. Let your wife find out what kind of man she married. Let your boss see the truth about you. Let everyone see who you really are. You're just going to let her ruin my life. Evan's voice rose, panic overtaking his composure. Like you helped ruin mine. Dean stepped around his desk, closing the distance between them. That's not my concern. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. Evan threw up his hands in a gesture of surrender, backing away. I thought maybe you could talk to her, get her to back off, help her see reason. See reason about what? Dean's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. That you're a coward, trying to dodge the consequences of your actions. That you're willing to abandon your own child just to protect yourself. It's not as simple as you think. My family deserves to know exactly what kind of man you are, Dean said coldly. A cheater, a liar, a coward who sleeps with another man's wife and then runs away when the consequences come knocking. Harper, please, Evan pleaded, using Dean's last name as a desperate attempt to appeal to him. If this gets out, I'll lose everything. Then you'll get exactly what's coming to you. Dean moved to the door and swung it open. Karma's a bitch, isn't it? Now get out before I have you thrown out. Evan practically bolted, nearly colliding with Tina as he fled the office. She turned to Dean, her face filled with concern. Is everything all right, Mr. Foster? Everything's fine. Dean adjusted his tie, trying to still his shaking hands. Hold my calls for the rest of the day. But the encounter with Evan had stirred up emotions Dean thought he'd buried, anger, pain, memories that came flooding back like a tidal wave. He found himself leaving work early, driving aimlessly until he ended up in their old neighborhood. He passed by the house he'd once shared with Carly, the place where he'd dreamed of building a family. A "for sale" sign was planted in the front yard, the windows dark and lifeless, another piece of their past being dismantled. He remembered the hours he'd spent painting those walls, building shelves in the garage, sketching out plans for renovations they'd never get to finish. All those dreams, reduced to ash by her betrayal. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Ryan again. Just got off the phone with Kelly. Ryan didn't waste time on pleasantries. Carly's sister says things are really bad. Worse than I thought. That's not my concern. I get it. But you should know, she lost her job last month. Apparently, she had a breakdown during a meeting, started crying when they brought up the Morgan project. Dean's grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles turning white. Still not my problem. Kelly says she's hit rock bottom, can't make rent, struggling to afford formula for the baby. Evan's not helping, and his wife, well, she found some old emails. The whole thing's about to blow up. Karma's finally catching up with them, huh? Seems like it. Ryan paused, the silence heavy. Kelly asked if you'd consider No, Dean's answer was sharp, final. She made her choices. Now she has to live with them. A week later, Dean was leaving the office when he saw her, Carly, hunched over the steering wheel of her old Honda in the parking lot. Even from a distance, he could see her shoulders shaking with sobs. The car was filthy, one of the taillights cracked, a far cry from the pristine vehicle she used to take such pride in. For a brief moment, memories flashed through his mind, times he'd seen her cry before. Tears of happiness at their wedding, the joyful tears when she told him she was pregnant. It was all a lie, every tear a manipulation. He got into his truck and drove away, not sparing her another glance. The next day, an email from Carly landed in his inbox. Dean, I know you hate me. I know I ruined everything we had. But I'm begging you, I need help. I lost my job, I can't cover the rent, and Evan won't even acknowledge his own son. I've got nowhere left to turn. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, I know I don't deserve it. But if there's any part of you that remembers what we shared, any piece of the man I once loved, please help me. Not for my sake, but for an innocent baby who had no say in any of this. I've lost everything, my job, my home, my pride, but the hardest loss to bear is you. You were the best thing in my life, and I threw it all away for nothing. Please, Dean, I'm drowning. Dean read the message once, then deleted it without replying. But her words lingered with him throughout the day, not because he felt guilt. He meant it when he said he'd never forgive her. It was the desperation that struck him. She had thrown away a solid marriage for a fling with a married man who now wanted nothing to do with her or the child they'd created. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Kelly, "She's losing everything, Dean." The apartment complex gave her a 30-day eviction notice. The car's about to be repossessed. I know what she did was unforgivable, but she's drowning. The baby is all she has left. He typed back, she should have thought about the consequences before she cheated. The 3 dots appeared as Kelly typed a response, she's been thinking about it every day since it happened. She cries herself to sleep every night, holding that baby, knowing she destroyed the only real love she ever had. I've never seen her so broken. Dean's reply was swift and cold, that's her problem, not mine. Kelly's response came quickly, the Dean I knew had compassion. His answer was immediate, the Dean you knew died the day your sister betrayed him. Don't contact me again. He switched off his phone, but Kelly's words gnawed at him. Compassion. Where was Carly's compassion when she was spinning her web of lies for 9 months? Where was her concern for his feelings while she was sneaking around with a married man? The next morning, Dean's phone rang, the caller ID showing an unfamiliar number. Mr. Foster, a woman's professional voice began. This is Patricia Blackwell from Clearview Apartments. Carly Walker is here applying for a lease, and she's listed you as a reference. Let me guess, he interrupted, his tone icy, she put me down as a reference. Yes, sir. She mentioned that you could verify. I can verify one thing, Dean cut in sharply. Carly Walker is a liar who can't be trusted. That's all you need to know. He ended the call, his hands trembling with fresh anger. The audacity of her, still using his name, still trying to leverage their past connection to dig herself out of trouble. A month later, he ran into her at Wilson's Market. She was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the polished, confident woman he'd once married. Her clothes were worn, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that barely masked its neglect. Dark circles hung under her eyes, and she pushed a cart filled only with the essentials, formula, diapers, generic brand groceries. The baby was with her, strapped into the cart seat, babbling softly. They noticed each other at the same time, freezing in place as their eyes locked across the produce section. For a moment, they just stared. Then Carly turned away, dabbing at her eyes with shaking hands. Dean, she whispered, her voice carrying across the quiet aisle. I didn't expect to see you. Don't, he said, turning to leave. But her next words made him pause. I got your message, she said, her tone hollow. About the apartment reference. They rejected my application. Every place I've applied to has. Not my problem, he replied coldly. I know. She attempted a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. Nothing's your problem anymore, right? Not me, not the baby, not the fact that we're about to lose our home. You're exactly right. He faced her fully now. None of it is my problem. You made your choices, Carly. You chose to cheat, you chose to lie, and now you're choosing to play the victim because karma finally came knocking. Play the victim? Her voice broke. You think I'm playing? Look at me, Dean. Look at what's left of my life. I am looking, he said, his tone frigid. And I see exactly what you deserve. Tears spilled down her cheeks, unchecked. I know I deserve this. Every bit of it. But he doesn't. She gestured to the baby. He's innocent in all of this. Then take it up with his father, Dean retorted, turning away. Oh, that's right, Evan wants nothing to do with either of you, doesn't he? He left his cart right there and walked away, not bothering to look back. He didn't need to see her tears, didn't need to feel the weight of her desperation. This was the bed she'd made for herself. That evening, Ryan called again. Evan's wife found out everything, he said without preamble. Apparently, Carly confessed everything to her. Now the guy's marriage is crumbling. He's on leave from work while they conduct an ethics investigation. Couldn't happen to a better guy, Dean replied, his voice void of any sympathy. Yeah, well, he's still refusing to help with the baby. His wife's threatening to take him for everything in the divorce, though. Ryan paused, his tone softening. Carly's really hit bottom. Kelly says she's moving in with her next week, she can't afford to live on her own anymore. That's her problem, Dean said bluntly. I know. Just thought you'd want an update on how karma's playing out. Ryan hesitated. Kelly also asked about you. She wanted to know if you were seeing anyone. Tell her to mind her own business. Already did, Ryan sighed. Look, man, I get it. What Carly did is unforgivable. But seeing her destroy herself like this. She destroyed herself the moment she decided to cheat, Dean cut him off. Everything that's happened since then is just the fallout. A week later, Dean was leaving work when he spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench outside his office building. It was Carly. She looked even worse than she had at the grocery store, her face gaunt, her clothes hanging loosely on her thin frame. The baby lay asleep in a carrier at her feet. When she saw him, she stood up slowly but didn't approach. Instead, she simply stood there, tears streaming down her cheeks, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she were trying to keep from falling apart. What are you doing here? Dean's voice was cold and distant. I just needed to see you, Carly stammered, her voice breaking. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. For everything. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it all away. And now, she gestured helplessly at herself, a shadow of the woman she once was. Now I'm paying the price every single day. Karma has a way of making things right. I know. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. Evan won't even acknowledge his own son. His wife is tearing him apart in the divorce, she's taking the house, the cars, half of his pension. He's been suspended from work for the ethics violation. A bitter laugh slipped from her lips. He's lost everything, just like I have. Actions have consequences. They always catch up sooner or later. They do. She glanced down at the baby, still asleep in the carrier. You know what hurts the most? The absolute worst part? It's realizing that I had someone who truly loved me, who would have been an incredible father, and I threw it all away for nothing. One stupid mistake cost me everything that mattered. Dean watched her, feeling nothing but a distant, detached satisfaction at her misery. Are you finished? Tears streamed down her face again. I deserve this. All of it. I just wish I could turn back time, make a different choice. I wish I could have chosen you. But you didn't. His voice was firm, unyielding. You chose to cheat. You chose to lie. Now you have to live with those choices. I know. She wiped at her tears, her hands shaking. I just wanted you to know that I get it now. I understand what I lost. You were the best man I ever had, and I'll regret losing you for the rest of my life. Spare me the regret, he cut her off sharply. Go back to your sisters. Rebuild whatever life you can from the wreckage of your decisions, but leave me out of it. Dean, please. Goodbye, Carly. He turned and walked to his truck without another glance back, her sobs fading into the background. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold. Tomorrow would bring a new day, but for Carly, it would only mean more of the same, more regret, more consequences, more of the karma she had earned. 6 months later, Dean was sitting in the living room of his new house, a sleek, modern place on the other side of town, a far cry from the suburban home he once shared with Carly. His phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. Figured you'd want an update, Carly's still staying with Kelly. She found work as a waitress, barely scraping by. Evan's divorce just finalized. He lost it all, his wife took the house, the cars, half his pension. He's moved back in with his parents. Karma is still doing its job. Dean didn't reply. He didn't need to. The past was behind him now, a distant memory marked only by a scar that had finally healed. He had rebuilt his life, stronger and smarter than before. His business was thriving, he had a new home, and his future stretched out ahead of him, free from lies and betrayal. As for Carly, she was left to live with the consequences of her choices. Every time she looked at her son, she'd be reminded of the cost of her infidelity. Every night, she'd lie awake, haunted by the love she'd carelessly thrown away. That was karma's true justice.